Hello, everyone. My name is Heather Reed, and thank you for being here with me today. I use she, her pronouns, and for those using accessibility technology, I'm a 61-year-old white female. I've got ash-colored hair, red glasses, and I'm wearing a navy top, and I'm coming to you from my home office. As a reminder of every episode of Event Contracts Exposed, I am not a lawyer, and nothing I discuss here should be considered legal advice. This is all about education, insights, and practical strategies offered by a seasoned event professional. That's me. So before we begin, I'd like to note that all content in this presentation is copyrighted and is the intellectual property of Planner Protect. It may not be copied, reproduced, distributed, recorded, or used in whole or in part without my explicit written consent. Thank you for respecting my work and my original content. So our topic today is micro events. So what is a micro event? Well, a micro event is commonly described as a small scale, highly targeted event designed for a limited audience, often delivered more frequently and with a focused objective. So I'll repeat that again. A micro event is commonly described as a small scale, highly targeted event that is designed for a limited audience, often delivered more frequently and with a focused objective. So I'm thinking about a micro event. Typically, it has anywhere from 10 to 100 attendees. Some sources say 150, but most sources say 10 to 100. It usually captures a specific audience segment, such as VIP clients or regional teams or niche interest folks or niche buyers. The micro event typically has a single clear objective, such as networking or education or sales activation, something like that. The micro event is typically a shorter duration, such as a few hours to a half a day, and sometimes a full day. And it often is in a simplified format, such as there's no massive production or there's fewer moving parts than you might expect from a larger event. So increasingly, organizations are incorporating micro events into their marketing playbook. Micro events are now a primary channel for organizations to drive both commerce and community. So what are the types of micro events? Well, they're unlimited in both format and approach, but some popular formats are private and intimate gatherings such as private dinners, fireside chats, networking meetups. It could also be gatherings based on niche topics or industry challenges and may be hosted by, for example, local chapters of national organizations, hobbyist groups, or special interest-based communities. A micro event might be presented by a brand or a corporation and be a branded product launch at which a company may unveil a new offering in a more interactive and controlled setting. A micro event might be a VIP experience and a pop-up kind of activation. And here we think of brand activations, personalized demos, limited time, immersive experiences. And also, it's not just in person, hybrid and virtual micro events can be undertaken in which you're connecting virtual and in-person participants. So then we think about, well, where are these micro events being held? So just like micro events can be unlimited in their format and in their approach, so too are the possibilities for locations in which to host micro events. And here there's like the possibilities are unlimited, but we think about creative spaces and studios, like co-working spaces, boutique hotels and restaurants, intimate estates or farms, You could think of a small wedding as a micro event with 25 people. Unique and non-traditional spaces. So here we may think of art galleries, clubs, rooftops, outdoor spaces. Again, that might be a rooftop. It could be a garden. It could be a park. And then even private homes. So the location is unlimited. However, one of the most concerning parts of micro events for me is what happens with contracting for the venue for micro events. So when we think about traditional locations for events, we think about perhaps hotels, conference centers, convention centers, perhaps larger restaurants, art galleries, things like that. But when we have micro events, we're also utilizing non-traditional and unique locations. And so I often wonder, is there even a venue contract to be negotiated? Does one actually exist? So when you think about using unique and non-traditional spaces, really the question is there a venue contract available? Is the client able to negotiate the existing terms of the contract? And are they able to determine if the venue is willing to negotiate additional clauses that may need to be added? And I think of often like hotels and conference centers and convention centers, they have extensive contract documents, but quite often what protects the client has to be added into that draft contract. And so just like these non-traditional or micro events, if there is an existing contract, we may need to negotiate additional terms into that draft contract. Now, if a venue contract is not available, is the client actually willing to proceed with their micro event? That's a question that would have to be taken up by the client and their legal team and their risk management and things like that. But if a contract is not available, it needs to be discussed with the location. Is there interest by both parties to create one? So it would be my risk-adverse nature to run from a venue or location that doesn't have an existing contract template or isn't willing to sign a client-drafted contract. So the client will then need to consult with their legal counsel if a confirmation email or a written record summarizing all of the discussed terms and deliverables and expectations is sufficient. And then if and how the venue acknowledges such a document. But I want to talk about the contracts, not a confirmation email, but contracts if you are negotiating an existing draft contract or co-creating a contract. I want to give you some considerations today for micro events. So just like any other event being planned, documenting the intent, the purpose, and the expectations of the micro event should be included in the venue contract. So what is the reason for the gathering? What is the rationale behind the gathering? What is the expected format of the micro event? How many are anticipated to attend? And what activities and or components, if you will, make up this little micro event? So just like I've talked repeatedly that we need a purpose of the event, a statement, sentences that describe and create the big picture of the event, we need to do the same for micro events, establishing what this is, why it is being held, who is coming, any potential risks, that sort of thing. So you want to establish that in any location or venue contract. Now, A contract is an exchange of consideration, and typically consideration is in the format of money. So the exchange of money is always a necessary consideration to have in a contract. So you will most likely be looking at, say, a rental fee. So there we go. I'm sorry about that. I pressed the wrong. So rental fee, is it a flat rate versus a full day or a half day rate? Is it even an hourly rate? Can those rates be negotiated? Can you come up with something unique for the rental for this event? Is there a minimum rental period? So if you want to have an event for 2 hours, but the minimum rental is 4, that may be a cost that you need to carry. And then really important, I think, in the rental fee is documenting and contracting what is actually included in the rental fee. So I know quite often if you go on a site visit, you'll see all of these things that, oh, that's all comes with part of the package. Well, be sure to document what is included. So are there tables and chairs? Is there AV, simple AV being provided? Does power exist and you're able to access that? Is there internet that you can access? Food and beverage needs, food and beverage serviceware, food and beverage equipment. Does that exist at the venue, or is that something you're going to have to bring in? The other consideration, not just the hard things that are included, what about staff positions that are included with the rental? So do you have banquet staff, for example, that are included? Do you have security personnel that are included? Do you have a contact person that's included, or a site manager? All of those kinds of things. What's included in the rental fee? And then just like we're talking about money, we also want to talk about payment terms in a contract. So you want to be negotiating if the venue or the location requires full payment right up front. So is that at the time of contract signing? Is the full payment required a certain number of days in advance of the event? If full payment's not required, perhaps it is a deposit and a payment schedule that you're looking at. So how much is the deposit? Is it a percentage of the spend? Is it a flat rate? Is the deposit required at the time of signing? Is the deposit required just a certain number of days in advance of the event? If you've made a deposit, you'll have presumably money to still spend and owe after. So when are the rest of the payments made? Are there additional payments made towards the event before the event dates? Is billing available such that you can pay after the event? All of that needs to be squared away in the contract. Don't make assumptions. Get it locked in as to specific terms of when money is exchanging hands. You may also want to know, how is the client's money protected? Is it going into a separate bank account for this client that the venue holds? Is it just going into their everyday operating bank account? What would happen to your money if the venue finds itself in insolvency or bankruptcy? So you want to be asking those hard questions. And then you also, in regards to payment, you always need to be talking about, when are deposits or payments refundable? Quite often you'll see language that says deposits are non-refundable. Well, there are circumstances where a client's deposit or payments are absolutely refundable. If the venue cancels the contract, your money should be returned to you. If a situation of termination, such as a force majeure event, happens, then the client's money should be returned to the client. So all of these things need to be clarified around your deposits, the exchanging of funds from the client to the venue in promise of hosting the event there. All right. We also want to establish really good and clear timelines and venue access considerations. So these are crucial items to document in a venue contract, especially when we're talking about shorter events. They may not be days after days after days, and a 24-hour hold will work at the beginning of negotiating. It may be very short durations of time. So we want to establish what time can the client first enter the space? What time must the client have fully exited the space? The timeline should establish the setup start time. Then it should establish the attendee arrival time. Then it should establish the event end time, and then the tear down completion time. So one might think, well, 6 to 9 is fine. Well, what if it's your setup is 6 to 7? Your guests arrive at 7, they're there till 8:30, and then 8:30 to 9 is dismantling time. Then you might think about, well, what happens if I want to explore early access or even grace periods? So can the client access the space before the official setup start time? So I know in doing larger events, sometimes our document would say we could have the room at 7 a.m. on Thursday morning, but quite often we might have been able to squeeze in really late on Wednesday night. So you want to establish, are there any early access opportunities? Is there a grace period if the setup or the teardown or the event itself runs late? You may want to ask about what happens with staff that are on site to assist during the setup period and the teardown period. If that's overtime, then how is overtime charged? Is overtime strictly prohibited? You have to be in and out according to the contracted times. Who unlocks the space? Who locks the space? What happens if the client arrives and no one is there? Will the staff stay if the timeline goes into overtime? So really thinking about all the angles of, it may seem like a short event, but really the logistics are exactly the same as a larger event in thinking about setup, the existing event itself, and the teardown and leaving the property. The other point on this slide is that often the client hosting a micro event will need the supports of services and products from other suppliers. So quite often you might think of audiovisual, catering, decor, security, power, internet. It is imperative that the client establish the venue's rules and their expectations around third-party suppliers. So does the venue have any exclusive relationships established for specific services, such as the common ones are audiovisual, power, internet, catering? Then if there are exclusive relationships, who are they? What are they? And then are there some that are on a preferred basis? So in other words, the venue is recommending them to you. Or can the venue bring in whoever they want to? Are there limitations around that? So if the client wants to bring in their own third-party service providers, what are the financial implications of that kind of an arrangement? What fees or charges or surcharges, commissions, penalties? There's all sorts of names for what kinds of costs there may be when wanting to bring in your own third-party suppliers. So really vetting that aspect is really, don't make assumptions if it's not mentioned. Do not assume there may very well be relationships in place or preferences in place that you don't want to find out about after contract signing. So all of these negotiations should be discussed, negotiated, and documented in the venue contract. Another one that you may want to really consider, particularly around micro events where they're non-traditional or unique spaces, what about permits and licensing requirements? So local permitting often depends on site-specific factors such as street usage, food vendors, amplified sound, temporary structures, liquor licenses, special event permits, a gathering assembly permit, music licensing, fire department permits or inspections, occupancy load compliance, tent permits, stage permits, electrical permits. And I actually have even 3 or 4 more options here. Licensing and permits are a big deal. And if one is hosting a number of micro events, obviously the systemization and the tracking of local permits and licenses will become a critical responsibility. So in addition to knowing what permits and licensing requirements may be necessary, it is also imperative to establish who applies for these permits and licenses. Is it the venue? Is it the client? Is it the client's intermediary planner? Who pays for which licenses? Who pays for which permits? And who is liable if one or more of these licenses or permits are missing? And then speaking along that same line is talking about indemnification and insurance in a unique or non-traditional venue contract. Every contract should address indemnification and insurance. Even with 20 to 50 attendees, someone can slip and fall. Alcohol can create liabilities. Property damage can be done. Your liabilities don't scale down just because the attendee count goes down. Indemnification means if something goes wrong and it's your fault, you will cover the costs instead of the non-harming party. So if something goes wrong and the client is found to be at fault, the client will cover the costs incurred by the victim and or the venue. If something goes wrong and the venue, for example, is found to be at fault, the venue will cover the costs incurred by the victim and or the client. So that indemnification language helps to decide in advance who protects who if something goes wrong. And then to back that up, we want reference to insurance. It is the client's responsibility to ensure that the venue for their micro event carries proper and appropriate insurance. And we may find often that venue contracts will ask the client to carry appropriate insurances, but it is also our right to ask for the venue to show proof of insurances. Just like we don't want to do business without a contract, we probably don't want to do business with a venue that is not appropriately and properly insured. In micro event venues, particularly those non-traditional options, the operations or the infrastructure may be informal or at least less structured than the ones that we might expect from a more traditional option, such as a hotel or conference center. So the client hosting a micro event should be prepared to ask, then negotiate, and then contract for what happens if something goes wrong. Who is responsible for evacuation? Who is responsible for emergency services or calling them? Is there anyone on site to administer first aid? Who is responsible for guest flow on site? Who is monitoring exits and entries? Who else is on site at the venue over the same time period? Who is monitoring attendee behavior, especially if alcohol is involved? And equally important is understanding and adhering to occupancy or capacity limits. So, does this include the venue staff? Does this include your third-party supplier providers' staff? How is capacity monitored? Who has the final authority to determine capacity? And we need those things documented in the contract. And then I also, knowing that you can't cover everything in 28 and a half minutes, I would not be true to myself if I also didn't mention that cancellation and termination must always be included. We don't have enough time to get into those today, but please know you can't have a checklist that doesn't have cancellation and termination. So I want you to remember that micro events may be small in attendance, they may be short in duration, they may be singular in focus, but they are not low risk. Micro events are just risks that are often repeated over and over again. And as such, they require more intentional contracting, not less. If a venue has a contract, negotiate. It is the client's responsibility to ensure that their needs, their expectations, their logistical operations or needs, and their financial risks are adequately protected. If the venue does not have a contract, make one. Collaborate with the client's legal counsel, the venue, and the venue's legal counsel to create one. Remember that everything published and experienced in relation to micro events states that the same fundamental premise exists, and that is micro events are not simpler. They're simply smaller in attendance. So despite their size, micro events introduce many of the same legal and logistical complexities as larger events. And as a result, they require the same level of due diligence. What you might think of instead of micro event is macro level attention when it comes to venue contracting. All right. Before you leave today, or I leave, or both leave, I have 3 reminders. One, if you want to learn more about this or event contracting, specifics or in general, please check out cecp.plannerprotect.ca about the certification program. That is where we teach not just the what and the why, but more critically, the how to negotiate event contracts. And then please register for next month's Event Contracts Exposed, May 20th. How can event contracts be risk shields in an unstable world? And then my final thought, as always, is this. A well-negotiated event contract isn't just a document. It is your power, it is your protection, and it is your peace of mind. Bye for now, folks.